Hello, welcome to another episode of Seeds of Flourishing. So I'm very much still in the consciousness studies groove for these episodes. And what I thought I'd do for this episode is it's going to be a follow-on from a comment that was made on last week's episode, a really helpful and informative comment. So thank you very much for the person that commented on that original video, episode 57. And I thought as a result of the comment, I would expand on some of the links that I included as a response to that comment to help anybody that happened to be reading through that comment and wanted a few extra links in addition to the helpful link that was included by the original poster to this particular article. So the original poster's comment had a link to this paper, Edelman's Steps Towards a Conscious Artifact. So I thought it would be interesting in this episode to sort of just riff around some of the things that are covered or opened up in this particular paper, but also some of the areas that were covered in the original comment. So here's the paper. It's a fairly short paper, 7 pages long, and I suppose you could look at this, the way I look at this is a really interesting jumping off point in which to explore Gerald Edelman's thinking around conscious artifacts, or consciousness generally, actually. But what I noticed straight away when I was reading through this, and not made me kick myself, but made me go, hang on, I've seen this before, and there'll be a couple of instances of, I suppose, a sort of form of deja vu, as often happens when you're going through recommendations. You suddenly realise that you've stumbled across aspects of this before and not really noticed it with your full attention. So as soon as I saw this, I thought that sounds familiar. So there's an on-consciousness podcast which is ongoing, and it's, primarily Bernard Bars on the episodes talking about consciousness, but quite a lot of the episodes featured David Edelman, who is Gerald Edelman's son. And so what I'm going to do is, in the description for this video, I'm going to include links to the podcast as it's featured on Podbean, the podcast, or the link for the one on Apple Podcasts, and the link for the version on Spotify. But just going back to Podbean, I not really explored Podbean that much, but what I like about the website is it's really easy to not only play the episode without seemingly logging into anything, but also to check out the show notes, the key points in the episode, and also websites and other links, social media and individual social media links for the participants. And as I'd already mentioned previously, quite a number of these episodes, a fair few, feature his son in it, as well as obviously Bernard Bars. So yeah, well worth a listen. If you can only manage one episode, listen to the first one. It's a really interesting way in which they've put together the podcast, and it draws down from lots of different sources. So yeah, check out, if you can only check out one episode, check out the first one. So I'm just going to quickly give you an overview of some of the interesting points that were touched on in the original comment on last week's episode on consciousness studies, and in the paper as well. It's not everything, but I think it's going to give anybody watching this episode an interesting starting point to explore further. So Gerald Maurice Edelman was an American biologist who actually shared the 1972 Nobel Prize in Physiology or medicine for work with Rodney Robert Porter on the immune system. And at that point, his research revolved around the study of antibody molecules. But what was interesting is he subsequently went on to explore or do work in neuroscience and philosophy of mind. So in interviews he said that the way the components of the immune system evolve over the life of the individual is analogous to the way the components of the brain evolve in a lifetime. There is a continuity in the way between his work on the immune system. There is a continuity in this way between his work on the immune system, for which he won a Nobel Prize, and his later work in neuroscience and philosophy of mind. And just talking about the theory of consciousness aspect, there is a particular area which I think, it's a bibliography, which is referred to as a neural Darwin, or theory referred to as neural Darwinism, and we'll come back to that in a moment. Now, in exploring his bibliography, and this is, you can see here, there is actually a book he authored called Neural Darwinism. There was also this book, A Universe of Consciousness, which he co-authored with, is that Giulio Tonini? I should have looked up the pronunciation. Giulio Tonini. So here's the book they co-authored together, A Universe of Consciousness, How Matter Becomes Imagination. And the reason why I point this one out rather than specifically the other one listed there, the first book, is you can see it does mention here that it's a culmination of a series of works by Gerald Edelman on the workings of the brain, which include neural Darwinism and Bright Air, Brilliant Fire. So it's sort of bringing together these things and these concepts that he's sort of developed and explored over time. And I'll also include an article as well on the co-author. So back to this neural Darwinism. It's a biological, or more specifically, Darwinian and selectionist approach to understanding global brain function, originally proposed by Gerald Maurice Edelman, and it was introduced in the book by the same name, and it introduced the public to this theory of neuronal group selection, or TNGS, which is a core theory underlying Edelman's explanation of global brain function. And of course, it's not the only theory that involves, global brain function or global approaches to the way in which consciousness may or may not work. But what I found interesting is, the different overlaps between some of the similar theories going on, and whether or not the particular proposer of the theory is the theory is placed within the realms of computational models or non-computational models, the rejection of computational models. And this particular one, as you can see here, there is a rejection of computational models within neural Darwinism. Now, I haven't read around this sufficiently to know what that position is, and has it shifted anyway over time. But what was interesting is I stumbled across another article which talked about similar non-computational approaches, but it was more in the area of it was under consciousness studies, but it wasn't so much philosophy of mind, which I just happened to be exploring that particular occasion, and so I didn't dig much deeper into that particular paper, so unfortunately I don't have it linked here. But it was interesting to find another article talking about non-computational theories of consciousness. Now, the other thing you might stumble across when you're reading through neural Darwinism, or as we have here, theory of neuronal group selection, TNGS, is primary consciousness. So this is a term coined by him to describe the ability found in humans and some animals to integrate observed events with memory to create an awareness of the present and immediate past of the world around them. This form of consciousness is also sometimes called sensory consciousness. Put another way, primary consciousness is the presence of various subjective sensory components of consciousness, such as sensations, perceptions, and mental images. And you can compare that with also this idea of secondary consciousness. So name check there as well. Is an individual's accessibility to their history and plans. The ability allows its possessors to go beyond the limits of the remembered presence of primary consciousness. Primary consciousness can be defined as a simple awareness that includes perception and emotion. As such, it is ascribed to most animals. By contrast, secondary consciousness depends on and includes such features as self-reflective awareness, abstract thinking, volition, and metacognition. So metacognition is the awareness of one's thought processes and an understanding of the patterns behind them. And you get into areas of this thinking about thinking. Now, as I've mentioned before, as I was going through all of this, it minded me to have a look at a book I had. And this is a book called Conversations on Consciousness by Susan Blackmore. And I actually started reading it before I go to bed. It's quite nice. These are a series of interviews that she conducted with various writers on consciousness. And each of the chapters is a nice length. It does make ideal bedtime reading. Well, for me anyway. I mean, it doesn't keep me up. But I've read a couple of chapters so far. But what was interesting is the very first chapter featured an interview with Bernard Bars, and interestingly enough, he name checks Gerald in it in the interview, And the other interesting thing about this, and it's a pity it didn't go further, my understanding is that this originally started out as an attempt by Susan Blackmore to do, I think, a BBC series about this. Now, that never came to fruition, but as a result of trying to put that together with, I think it was the BBC, there were obviously a series of audio files or interviews that were collected, and so this resulted in the publication of this book. But it would have been really interesting if this had actually been turned into a BBC series. It'd been really cool, rather like a modern day equivalent of the Brian McGee philosophical discussion ones back in the day. But think of how cool that would have been to have a philosophy of mind version of that. So yeah, I was a bit felt a bit, I'm trying to think of the word, but it did sadden me when I read in the introduction that's actually what had happened, and that was the original intent. So you never know, you might end up with something like this. And of course there's loads of interviews of similar things on YouTubes and other podcasts, but yeah, this would have been a great sort of snapshot in time. This came out in 2006. And I was going to see if there was anything I'm not sure, I never know with Google previews how deep it goes. Let me see if I can get to the section about where he does mention Gerald. Oh, here we go. So here's his interview. I recognise some of the artwork here from Susan Blackmore's book on consciousness, actually. Certainly the style. Oh, here we go. Sorry about this. I know some people don't always like scrolling. But oh, here we go, yeah. And so she's asking the question about, there was a comment made about, like, at that point where we were in terms of, I think, understanding consciousness. And in the interview, Bernard Bars makes this point about people in other areas of science and, you know, certain things happening at certain points. And I think she was making this point as, you know, do we have around us, you know, like a equivalent to Faraday or Galvani, somebody who is going to sort out our understanding? And Bernard Boss says, we'll find out in about 100 years. But I think we have lots of people who would like to be the Galvani or the Faraday. There are some very nice proposals around, some of them coming from neurophysiologists. And he's just saying, you know, I'm a cognitive psychologist. And then he goes on to mention, at this point, there are some things that the psychological ideas explain and that the neurophysiology doesn't yet explain, and vice versa. And then he says there's this rather wonderful theory proposed by Gerald, I'm going to pronounce this completely different than I did up till now, Edelman, a Nobel Prize winner in immunology, who has since become a neuroscientist, is called Neural Darwinism, and is Darwinian in the sense that it deals with the cooperation and competition between massive numbers of neurons in the brain. What becomes conscious in Edelman's view is the winning coalition of neurons, those that outvote the other neurons. That is called the dynamic core hypothesis, and there's a great deal of evidence that's consistent with it. And then it just goes on to talk about Bernard Barr's global workspace theory, which he's famous for. Yeah, so So the only downside with these sort of books is that they do jump around quite a bit. But I think they're a good leaping off point if you do want to explore certain writers on consciousness. And I'm definitely enjoying reading it. There's no problem with the book in that respect. But yeah, you may find that it doesn't always go in the direction you think it's going to go, put it that way. So I just thought I'd finish off with that, because it was interesting how I sort of ended up back around that to a book that I'd bought sometime in the late 2000s, and it does actually mention Gerald Edelman. I'll get it eventually. So thanks once again for watching. Bye for now, and I will catch you in the next video.